This is WFNP 88.7 Rosendale. Welcome to Curiosities of the Cosmos. I'm your host, Allyson Sheneman. Today I've brought on Grace Sotillo to talk about psychology.
Welcome to Curiosities of the Cosmos with Allyson Sheneman. My guest today is Grace Sotillo, a junior at SUNY New Paltz studying psychology and disaster studies. She aspires to work in the mental health field and is an advocate for equitable, supportive, and positive mental health care and awareness. She believes everyone deserves support to feel at peace and in control of their mind, health, and wellness. Grace, thank you for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here. So this is amazing.
Yeah, I'm so excited to have you. For our listeners, Grace is a good friend of mine. We've had many wonderful, incredible conversations on some long car rides together. So I'm really excited to see what kind of insightful commentary she brings to this show. So thank you for taking the time to be here today.
Oh my gosh, of course. I love our deep car ride conversations. They're the best.
So good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is going to be great. You guys are in for a treat. I'm just saying.
I feel the same way. So first, we're just going to kind of open up the conversation about psychology in general. So I understand that you have kind of taken a couple different courses and explored a couple different majors before landing in psychology. Would you like to talk about your experience with testing those out and what it was that really drew you to kind of settle into psychology?
Yeah, absolutely. I had a bit of a long journey, but it's a journey that I'm proud of to sort of land at where I'm at because I really love what I do now. I originally went to college for music therapy, which is pretty similar to psychology, but it's, the incorporation of how music affects the body. And I thought it was really cool, but to be honest, the job prospects weren't super great for the field, and it wasn't a field that was taken very seriously. And so that's sort of what drew me away from that field. And then I was interested in working in the medical field, so I wanted to go into biology. And what drew me in towards that is, unfortunately, I had a lot of experiences being in hospitals sort of leading up to that situation. And I remember feeling so inspired watching the medical professionals work in the hospitals and seeing them have the knowledge that they had of the human body and what works for the human body and what doesn't, and being able to keep a human body alive was so cool. It was really, really cool. And I really wanted to have that knowledge. I think the human body is so fascinating. I still do to this day. And so that's sort of what drew me in towards there. But then I took the classes and I wasn't super into it. They were challenging. I'm not sure entirely what your experience has been with taking the STEM classes, but I found the learning environment to be a little discouraging.
Yeah.
And I think ultimately I was more interested in the healing experience for people and what that looks like for people and helping them through their healing experience in conjunction with their bodies. And I found the hard sciences to just be a little too hard for me. And I was a bit more interested in the emotional world of the human experience. And so that's sort of what then led me into psychology. And I love it because now it's a perfect combination of the scientific stuff. I mean, I learn all about neurochemistry and the brain structures and how the body interacts with the brain to create the world that we live in our bodies, but also the socio-cultural aspects of psychology as well. In psychology, there's this whole debate of nature versus nurture, and that's sort of in contemporary psychology, it's the acknowledgement that it's both. That's what makes us who we are, is our biology and evolution, as well as the environment we grow up in and the sociocultural factors. And so to me, that's why psychology is just the perfect combination of both. But I really respect all the fields that I've sort of tried to study in. They just weren't the perfect fit for me, but I think they're great. Yeah. So, yeah, that's sort of what led me there.
Yeah, totally. I think, too, something that I hear in the way that you describe how interconnected they really are still is that you wouldn't be you without a little bit of all of them.
Absolutely.
And
yeah.
so all of them get to kind of inform your practice and your experience and the way that you approach psychology, that maybe you do lean more into studying some of the more biology leaning aspects of psychology because you did have that love for biology and for that part of the healing process. And maybe a part of your practice will involve music because of your experience doing music therapy as a program and things like that. So I think it's really cool to see how being interdisciplinary doesn't stop when you quote unquote like settle into like a specific field. So deciding on psychology doesn't mean you lose how interdisciplinary you are and were in trying out all of those other things still too.
Absolutely. And I think I honestly wouldn't recommend it more enough for anybody who wants to study psychology to also study other things with it, because psychology is so vast and you really are discussing the human experience. And what is the human experience without biology, without music, without art? And so to have knowledge in all these other things that you can bring in and give context to all these like complex theories about the mind, I think is a really wonderful thing. And I think it only enhances my education more. So
yeah, absolutely. And I know I don't know if it's technically a minor or a concentration with disaster studies, sorry. How does that tie in for you, that area?
That's my minor.
Yes.
It's super awesome. At the college that I'm attending, SUNY New Paltz, we have this disaster studies program. And it's so funny because every time I tell that to someone, especially like my mom, I'll be like, yeah, like I'm doing a disaster studies minor. Like everyone always laughs and is like, what is that? Like disaster studies? Like that's wild. And I think it's really cool and something that, I think would be important for a lot more institutions to have. And it's basically the study of disasters. So it's not necessarily a fully psychological field of study. So that could either be natural disasters or human-made disasters, which are large-scale emergencies where the resources in the community are depleted. And that's what constitutes a disaster. And so in the classes that I'm taking, it does look at the more psychological aspect of disaster and offering things such as psychological first aid, which is something that in America, the American Red Cross offers when they come to do crisis intervention in disasters. But also the field of study looks at scientific things. What causes natural disasters? How can we prevent more natural disasters from happening as, climate change is advancing? Or if, we really can't stop them from happening, how do we better deal with them from a scientific standpoint, from a sociological standpoint, from a policy-making standpoint? It's a very vast sort of discipline.
Yeah.
So I think it's really awesome. I know that in New York State, part of our Office of Mental Health has a disaster institute, I believe. I'm not 100% part of that Office of Mental Health, and it's something that gets funding into how do we support people when natural disasters hit, or man-made disasters, which if you're not sure what that means, that's like mass shootings, or if there's like oil spills or like different tech disasters, things blowing up, things that have a human cause to it. That's basically all that means. But yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I've heard of people taking like those courses and being a part of that field of study, and I never fully knew what it meant. And so I guess there was a part of me that just always pictured like the type of people that go in after an earthquake or a hurricane and try to like rebuild houses and like support a community. And so it's really fascinating to me to hear like all of the different both types of disasters and also types of relief that a disaster might like warrant. So I think that's so awesome.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So with that as your minor and with psychology kind of as a whole, what are like careers that you're both that you specifically are interested in going into, but also that somebody with that kind of background and experience has access to?
That's a great question. A million things.
Yeah,
That's,
I imagine.
Yeah. There's so many ways you could go with this. I'll start with specifically my interests, because I think we would take up the whole podcast episode talking about every possible option. But for me, I definitely am more interested in micro level work, which is more one-on-one work than it is work within a whole community.
Gotcha.
So for me, I'm very interested in working in psychotherapy. That's something that I am very interested in. I'm interested in working in counseling. So a lot of the disaster studies classes that I'm taking discuss how trauma affects the body and the brain, and positive interventions when someone faces traumatic events in their life. So that's sort of what I am hoping to take from this, as well as learning what the impact of society has on an individual. So that's sort of where I'm sort of leaning towards working with individuals who may have experienced trauma, or if not trauma, just hardship in their lives. That's sort of my career interests, but I'm also open to a lot of things. I think we definitely need more community in our lives, and that's something that this line of work could lead to, is more community building and support for communities, and that's definitely something I'd be interested in as well. So a variety. There's a lot of things. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like the kind of field that you could really do just about anything with. It seems like the kind of person you'd want on a staff, like regardless of the like job.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So that actually brings us to our timestamp for our first segment of the show.
Cool.
So the first segment on the show is called Should We Be More Worried About? Where from years of public science communication, and also just from like 20 odd years of being a human on this planet, I hear people talking about certain topics, and the ones that there tends to be more buzz around tend to maybe have a little bit more confusion surrounding them also. And so I just kind of take a bunch of topics that I feel as though maybe people are more worried about than they should be, or less worried about than they should be, and invite a guest that I feel has some expertise in that area to address what they think people should or shouldn't be worried about. So Grace, my question for you is, should we be more worried about misunderstandings surrounding neurodiversity?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
I definitely think it's something we should be more worried about. Although I think worry might not be necessarily the right word I would put for this situation, but rather something we should be more informed about.
Totally.
Because I think what's super awesome about the world and the social climate we're in today is that psychology and mental health is just gaining more awareness, which is something that just wasn't really a thing 20 years ago. And so it's awesome that people are starting to, take charge of their mental health. However, in that, there are definitely a lot of terms from psychology that are being misused in a mass way. One of the most clear examples of this to me is the term gaslighting.
Yeah.
People love to say the word gaslighting and they don't know what it means. And but another one of those words is the term neurodivergence. Maybe it's just my circles that I see in the world and on the internet, but it's something that gets brought up a lot, of what is neurodivergence, and oh, that is so neurodivergent of you. And I think there's an important distinction between neurodivergence and this term neurodiversity. They're two different terms, and also the term neurotypical. And so I'll describe what all of them are for everyone. So neurodivergence, to start, is a clinical term used to describe when somebody has a clinical diagnosis of a neurodevelopmental disorder. So these can be autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, learning disabilities, different intellectual disabilities, all fall under being neurodivergent. And so this is supposed to refer to literally your neural system being rewritten in a way that's different than most typical brains. So your responses are different. And so then neurotypical refers to any individual who does not have this diagnosis. However, the term neurodiversity is a term that applies to everybody. And this is something that I think deserves to be talked about more, because everybody is neurodiverse. There is no one way that your brain is supposed to function. There are typical things that, we should be meeting in development, and certain reactions that are typical to different situations in life. But every brain is different and is made up of our unique life experiences. And so I think something that I hear a lot from people when they're distressed about something, or even if they do have a diagnosis of ADHD or depression or anything, they'll look up, like, what's typical for this? And then when they see that their behaviors don't align with what is typical for the people around them and those that are similar to them, they start to freak out. And the thing is that everybody really is different and everybody reacts differently. And I think bringing more awareness that just the way that you work as a person in your brain is just the way that you work, and that's the way that you function, and that's great for you because it keeps you alive and it keeps you going through life. And just because that looks different from someone else, it doesn't mean that you're wrong or that you're broken. And bringing more awareness that there are multiple ways to learn. This is great for school environments, and there's multiple ways to cope with situations, I think would really reduce a lot of the feelings of guilt and shame. And those are big feelings that are really hard for people to cope with. And so I do think it's something we should be more informed about, is being aware of what neurodiversity means. And also, not everything that's different about you or atypical about you does not mean that there's something clinically wrong with you, or that there's something that needs to be diagnosed and treated. You're just different. And that's genuinely okay. So I definitely think so.
I relate to so much of what you just said. And I feel like, to me, something that I always think about is like the way that your brain has been evolutionarily advantageous to your ancestors, and that's how you got here, right? And so maybe that's bringing in the biology approach to what you studied too.
Absolutely.
That the way that your brain is wired is designed to be that way from generations and generations of experience. And sometimes that's because you're designed to find faces in things where there might not be faces, because your hopes as an ancestor who's maybe foraging way back, it's better for them to assume that something has a face and is an animal and is something scary, than to assume that it's not and therefore get mauled by a tiger.
Right, yeah.
And so there are things that your brain is wired for in that sense, in this big larger picture ancestry sense. And then also in the past few generations, even, where traumatic events occur and those new developments are also passed down genetically. So I think it's really cool to think about the fact that your brain is the way that it is because of so many people's experiences before you.
Absolutely.
But I also think what you were saying about not every trait that you might have warrants its own diagnosis. And something that I feel I relate to a lot is, especially in coming to a school where psychology is our most popular major, and therefore I have a lot of people who are very well informed about psychology all around me, that the way that you are and the traits that you have is not a list of symptoms. It's just the way that you are.
Absolutely.
And some of those things might be symptoms of a certain type of disorder or something that would warrant a diagnosis. But I think it's really important to also be able to separate yourself from a label and just exist in the way that you are. And I know, of course, obviously that does warrant its own disclaimers of it's important to have diagnoses and access to diagnoses in order to make sure that people have access to appropriate healthcare and other services from that. But also to recognize that there are positives in that, and every diagnosis, especially when we're talking about things related to the brain, come with their own kind of positive side effects too, in a way that you might for example, with somebody with ADHD, they might struggle more with schedules and time management and things like that, but they also might have exceptional like hyper focus on things that they like are really interested in. So there's always pros and cons. But
Absolutely. Yeah. I love every single thing you said. The evolutionary points are great and fantastic. I love that. And also, I totally agree. I think, there's something really special about focusing on the strengths of people.
Yeah.
Because the world is built around one type of brain. But that doesn't mean that that is the right brain and the right way to do things. And I think it's really important to empower people. And I do think that, yes, diagnoses are important. And for some people, it's amazing to receive a diagnosis because you've struggled your whole life with something. And finally, you have a name to know that it's not something wrong with me personally. It's this diagnosis. For some people, that's a wonderful feeling. For others, it's not as wonderful of a feeling to be labeled as something needing to be treated.
Totally.
And the stigma that comes with that, especially when you're getting a diagnosis of something that's not accepted as popular in the mental health field, like schizophrenia. And so I think in some ways the focus on diagnosis is harmful for sure. And I think, when you focus too much on what's wrong with me and what needs to be fixed, then that just creates even more shame and guilt in someone when really they could be thriving in so many other ways. And, the main reason that someone receives a diagnosis is either because they can't function on a day-to-day basis or it brings them extreme distress.
Yeah.
Those are the qualifications for a diagnosis. So yeah, while you might have symptoms that are part of your personality, if that's not bringing you distress in your day-to-day life, that's okay.
Yeah.
You can have those symptoms or traits in your life, and that's totally cool. It doesn't mean that you have to be labeled any sort of way. You're just you, and that's how you are.
Yeah.
And I think, that's a better sort of mindset shift to look at those sorts of things.
Totally. I think there's something very both powerful and empowering about like really being able to be you and like lean into the way that your personality is without having to like worry about what it might be too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
With that being said, I hate to interrupt us here, but we do have to cut to our first break. So everybody stay tuned and we will be right back. All right, welcome back to WFNP 88.7 The Edge, Rosendale. This is continuing with Curiosities of the Cosmos. I'm your host, Allyson Sheneman, and I am joined by Grace Sotillo, a junior and student of psychology and disaster studies at SUNY New Paltz. So we just had an incredible conversation about neurodiversity and about how like psychology and biology relate and a million different things. And we're going to continue now with more on psychology kind of in general. So can you tell us something that you think that you've learned in a psychology class that you wish either more people knew or was talked about more?
I think yes.
Maybe too many?
I'm really trying to narrow it down in my head. I really think the last conversation that we had is definitely something that's important to me. What I also think is important to know that I've taken, maybe this is not as much of a specific fact as much of it is sort of like a theme of the classes I've had. I think more people should know just how complex the brain is. I think a lot of people look for really direct answers when it comes to psychology, and sometimes they think of the field and they think, oh, well, this is a scientific field. It's studying the brain. You should have concrete facts for me about how the brain works. And that's just not really how it works as much. Of course, we have some things. We know that there are certain hormones that mean different things, but the brain is really complex and really interconnected with the whole neural system in the body. And so I think it's important to know that there's a lot more research that needs to be had in psychology, and there's not going to be one simple answer to anything psychologically related. that somebody might bring up. There are multiple theories in psychology, and the saying goes in all of my classes that you can never say anything proves something in psychology. You can only say it correlates to something.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that.
Yes. And so I think a lot of people try to look for things that are psychologically proven to work, and sometimes they don't work. I hear it a lot when people talk about meditation, because I know some people that are like, what is meditation? It does not work for me. It only stresses me out. It's not going to work for everyone. It's not like a medication. And even medications don't work for everyone. It's not something that is just going to instantly make you calm. And I think a lot of people look for black and white answers, and that's just not something that the field of psychology can really give. And so that's why it's important to sort of have experts be able to sort of analyze an issue or a topic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to, in talking about any science, to talk about how the research is conducted. And so I really like that you brought up how also the perspective on research, how the research is happening, what people's opinions maybe or concepts and ideas about what psychology is based on research. And I'm just kind of curious. I know you've mentioned to me before that you've taken a research methods class. So I'm curious as to what psychology research looks like, and maybe ethical things surrounding what it means to have humans as your subject of study.
Absolutely. I would love to talk about this. The ethics behind psychological research have a pretty dark history, because psychology wasn't really a thing until about World War II-ish. That's sort of when psychology started booming, because everybody looked at World War II and was like, how did this happen? How did we get to a point where this happened from a human nature perspective? And so that's sort of where psychology really began to boom. Of course, there were things beforehand, but it was just sort of here and there. And so psychology just boomed out of nowhere, and people just started doing studies, for fun, to just see what do people do. And there's a few key studies that were taught as psychology students that are these are so unethical, and these studies created I am completely forgetting the name of it now, but there is a law for psychological research that has ethical boundaries. And so now when you submit research, you have to submit it through a review board, an ethics review board, that looks and says, is this ethical? And so this looks at making sure that all the participants have informed consent. So that means that all participants know what is going to happen. This makes it difficult when you want to do something where the participants aren't supposed to know what happens. And so there are some ways you could get around that through the concept of deception, but that then requires debriefing after the study to make sure that there is no psychological harm, and if there is, that they're receiving treatment. But it's difficult. A lot of things that we want to study in psychology, we can't, because they will cause psychological harm. We can't really study trauma in a super controlled setting, because we can't just traumatize people. Right. The only thing we could do is then take people who have already been traumatized and interview them and ask them about their experience and how they're coping today. That's just one example of many things. Yeah. So the ethical considerations are huge in psychology, and it makes psychology research very difficult. And the other thing is that because it's not a hard science where you can really see, oh, this really proves something, that is why you could only say something correlates and not that something proves another thing. But we have a bunch of statistical backgrounds as well. It's important that the research has something backing it, and that it's not just people saying, I think this because this. We do try to make it as numerical as possible. But yeah, that's sort of a background on psychological research. It's pretty complex, for sure.
Yeah, I think that in hearing that, I'm reminded of the research that I did this past summer. And while the research was at Cornell's Astrophysics and Planetary Science department, where a vast majority of the fellow students that were researching alongside me were spending their whole summer and really, frankly, me as well, were spending their whole summer looking at either astrophysics, planetary science, some combination of both, and for the most part, just kind of coding. Some people were doing like actual things in lab. The vast majority of us were coding to try to like figure out the answer to a problem. And before we began any of our research, the first thing that we had to do was have a training on ethics. And a lot of my peers who only have backgrounds really in astronomy or physics or some type of engineering, in taking that, we're kind of like, why are we taking this? We're just going to be putting numbers into a code and putting like code together and trying to figure out if like, or some of them were like mapping the surfaces of like comets or asteroids. It's like, they were like, what do I need ethics for? And so I really think it's important to highlight the reason that those exist, because it's not just for whatever research you're doing or whatever field you're in. It's to make sure that all research across the board is conducted ethically. And so in reading those, you have to write, or in taking that, you have to like claim the stuff that you're doing in your research and why it is ethical. And so in filling those out, you fill out a bunch of forms, and they ask you if you have any like live animal test subjects, any like non-living animal test subjects, and what you plan to do. And you have to like claim all of these things. And I think it's so important that those are so thorough and they cover every aspect of the science you might conduct, because it helps us to, in a more modern world now, move away from more harmful practices within research and science.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many things to consider with the ethics, and I think one of the most striking of unethical research that I could think of is the syphilis study that happened from the 40s to 70s. I'm not sure if you're aware, but for anybody who doesn't know, I don't know the exact details of the study. I just know the gist of it. But researchers were trying to find a cure for syphilis. And so what they did was they took advantage of Black Americans who were at the time, dealing with the civil rights movement, and they took advantage of the fact that a lot of them didn't have access to health care. And what they said to them was, we are trying out treatment for syphilis, and we'll give you free treatment if you are a part of our trial. And what they did not tell them was that some of them received placebo treatment and were not receiving any treatment for syphilis whatsoever. And many of those individuals died or got very sick from syphilis, which is incredibly unfortunate. But that is one of those that sticks so strong in my head of, while the research was maybe trying to do something good, in the end they manipulated all of these people, took advantage of the fact that they didn't have access to health care, and completely lied to their faces in the name of research. And, that's something that was a very biological medical study. And so while, yes, maybe you're not doing as something as psychological, but you need to be aware of the implications of your study and who this is affecting, and looking at the socioeconomic factors around any of the research that you're doing, and what is this actually contributing to people. And so that's just one of those examples that I think of. That's why it's so important to learn about ethics, because there should never be a repeat of that situation ever again, because not only did that do everything to all of those people and their families involved in that study, but it created distrust in the medical system for millions of people, because now it's like, well, how do we know if they're lying to us or not?
Totally.
So having, even if you're doing something where it's like, what does this matter? Having these standards for ethics can maybe even try to reinstill even a little bit of trust and make sure that what we're doing is fair to everyone. So absolutely, I'm glad to hear that everybody's getting ethics training, because it really is so important. Yeah, and
I think, like, I couldn't have said it better. Like, that idea that the whole point is to make sure not only that the thing that you're doing is ethical, so you can go to sleep at night and sleep easy, but also that the community can begin to trust that they're not being lied to, that they're not being deceived, that they know that the types of research that are being funded, especially by, like, my research was funded by the National Science Foundation, NSF, which is like the biggest like funding source for a lot of these programs, to trust that the money that goes into like a program that's based on your tax dollar is conducting research that is ethical.
Right.
And I think the last thing that the scientific community can afford right now is to start breaking that trust, or
Absolutely.
like distancing itself from trust because people who are doing code as their research don't want to take an ethics.
Right.
Right. And it's not that
Right.
they didn't want to, but just that like that can't be reason enough.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
With that being said, we are also now going to move into our next segment. So this segment is called Curiosity Corner. So I'm going to give you 3 fun facts, and you're going to rate on a scale of 0 to 10 how like mind-blowing they are. So 0 being you've already heard it, it's something that's not very exciting or fun, and 10 is like I'm going to think about this every day for the rest of my life, good or bad.
Okay, sounds good.
So these are hand-selected, tailored for you specifically. So I'm excited to see your
Yay.
reactions to these. So for our first fun fact, this one is my first like psychology fun fact on the show. So I'm interested to know if you already know anything about this one, and if so, feel free to share anything extra. There are no reported cases of individuals who are born blind developing schizophrenia, and we don't really know why.
Whoa.
Yeah,
Really?
really.
Oh, wow. Sorry. Oh, my goodness. That's crazy. Okay.
Yeah,
Wow, that makes me think so much. I honestly did not know that.
yeah.
I'm going to rate that a 10.
Yeah.
I'm not going to lie. That's something
Really
that I would
cool.
love to think about.
Yeah,
That's
I have a quote to go along with that.
Mm-hmm.
So Thomas Sedlak, who is the director of the Schizophrenia and Psychosis Consult Clinic and an assistant professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Johns Hopkins Medicine, said, quote, "One theory might be that a person blind from birth learns to think in ways that are protective," end quote. In a way that it's maybe like, and this is all obviously guesses at what this
Right.
is, because we don't know for sure, right? And we
Yeah.
can't ever maybe know for sure to have that like proof that one kind of theory suggests that maybe being born blind makes you develop in a way that protects that part of your brain from developing schizophrenia
Yeah.
specifically.
I could totally see that. Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking that too, because I was like, well, you're already losing a sense
Yeah.
from birth. And so your body is already so reliant on your other senses to keep them intact. And, a large part of schizophrenia is those sensory delusions. And I guess, that makes sense. But I'm curious now if
Yeah.
people born deaf from birth have ever developed schizophrenia, because then at that hypothesis, then why would only blind people be part of that?
That is fascinating. Yeah, I'm gonna be honest. In looking this up, nothing ever came up suggesting that it was both for blind individuals and deaf individuals,
Interesting.
which makes me assume that because it was kind of like this big kind of hot topic that I was finding all of this information about, like what is it that might be the reason that blind
Right.
people don't, people who are born blind don't develop it. I didn't ever see anything about that being the same for deaf individuals, which makes me think that maybe just in that I didn't see it,
Right.
it might not also be the case. But one of the other speculations that I was seeing repeated online, which just means you're really good at what you do, that
Thank you.
it's this idea that because you're so reliant on these other senses, that they become so well developed that it's harder for, that's like maybe the protectiveness that he's
Right.
talking about too, that it becomes harder to distrust them or
Right.
to kind of like eat away at your certainty that you're hearing something
Right.
correctly or those kinds of things, because you become so reliant on them, and they are so like much more fine-tuned maybe than somebody who
Right.
doesn't have to rely so heavily on one less sense.
Right.
But yeah.
Wow. That's really fascinating. Thank
cool
you for
stuff.
sharing that. That's so cool.
Yeah, I think
Congratulations. You know what? I'm not going to say that. That goes against everything I've said prior to this interview. That's just cool.
congratulations to us for having learned that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Our next fun fact is that trees are not a taxonomic group, but they are a survival strategy. So a
Ooh.
taxonomic group is how we categorize things based on their like shared lineage. So trees don't fit into a monophyletic taxonomic group, which means they don't
What?
have one like shared ancestor from which
No
they
way.
all recently evolved from. But they're instead a strategy that a bunch of different species evolved independently in order to survive and compete for sunlight, that they all evolved to have trunks and branches and stuff
What?
like that.
Are you serious?
Very serious.
That is mind-blowing.
I know.
What?
I love trees.
I love trees.
Yes.
I can't wait to share that fun fact
We
with
should
everyone.
Start a tree fan club.
Yeah.
Love trees.
Tree huggers. The
Yes.
tree huggers of SUNY New Paltz.
Yeah.
No. What?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I'm giving that another 10.
Yes.
That's so cool. No way.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So that's
Almost
just
all
really
right.
shocking. And now I'm looking at the trees outside the
We're
window. Oh, good job, guys.
Yeah.
You're awesome.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
And the more that you learn about trees, I feel, the more that becomes something that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I almost didn't keep that on my fun fact list because I'm like so biased and I have to run these by other people before I like actually present them on the show because I never know what it is that people actually already know and what's like actually interesting. Because I remember the first time I heard that, I was like I must have heard it really late into my experience as a biology major.
Right.
Because the first time I heard it, I was like, okay. I was like, that makes about sense to me. Because trees really, I mean, it's like, they have lignin, which is just like a different substance, really,
Yeah.
that helps give them that like solid like wood structure.
Right.
And it's just a protein that like just about, I mean, any species that it would evolutionarily be advantageous for can evolve.
Wow.
And so to me, I was just kind of like, oh, okay. Like they just evolved separately, independently of each other. That makes sense. And not all of them. Some of them are closely related and some of them less so. But I'm excited to hear that was the reaction. Because also sometimes I nerd out about trees and people around me are like, they're literally trees. Like,
No, they're
I
not
love
just
trees.
trees. They're not just trees. I don't know if do we have time for me to ask you a question about
yes,
that?
absolutely.
So there's different types of trees, right? Like there's
Yes.
like an oak wood tree and an apple tree. And
Sure, yeah.
So how, I guess those wouldn't be like species of trees, right? If it's not like in a taxonomy. So how does that work? Like what's the difference there?
That's a great question. So they still have taxonomic categorizations. It's just that in order to be a monophyletic clade or grouping taxonomically, it has to involve one common ancestor and all of its descendants. And so because trees evolved independently through different lineages, they don't have that one common ancestor and all of its descendants. Because it's not recent enough for it to include all of the descendants.
Okay.
So there are things that trees are more closely related to, certain types of trees,
Right.
than what they are to other trees.
Right.
So trees themselves aren't really just like one like grouping of species.
Right.
They're a bunch of different species that evolved on their own.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but you can
Cool.
still like there's such a diversity amongst trees,
Right.
but some of them are still very closely related despite being a little like different from one another.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's the same with like certain types of animals and things like that. And the fact that like, for example, humans are more closely related to fungi than we are to plants. Than
That's a
that
cool
fungi
fun fact.
fungi are to plants. Sorry. Fungi are more closely related to us than they are to plants.
What? That's a cool fun fact.
Isn't that awesome?
awesome.
Just throwing them out. Yeah, because but you would think maybe not the case,
Right.
and people I feel are often surprised by that because well, fungi look a lot like plants, don't they? And they grow around plants, and they can't talk to me or make noises, so probably closer related to them. But they actually, in terms of where they branched off from those common ancestors, are more closely related to us.
Wow.
It's kind of cool.
That is so cool.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That is
course.
awesome. Wow.
Yeah. All kinds of, I love plants. I could talk plants for forever. I'm a big plant person.
Next car ride, let's do it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, we've got one coming up, well, for sure.
Yeah.
All right. And this next one, I feel also is one of those I learned in class, and I was kind of like, whoa, that's crazy. And then the more that I hear it, the less I'm like, whoa, that's crazy.
Right.
But I think everybody else is still like, whoa, that's crazy. So I love being the person to share this one with somebody for the first time.
Yeah.
So I hope if this one's a 10, which it doesn't have to be, but if it is, I hope this is one that you go around and you like tell your friends. Because this is a fun one to see people's face when they first hear it.
Totally. Yeah.
So the universe is geometrically flat and could be infinite.
Ooh. What is geometrically flat? Just like a sheet of paper sort of vibe?
No.
Okay.
Super no. So
Okay.
that is everybody's first instinct, right? It's like, how can you be infinite, but be like not infinite in one dimension if it's flat?
Right.
That's not true. It would be infinite on all sides around you equally,
Okay.
which is crazy.
So it's just like...
It is geometrically flat in that the like space itself, if you were to like draw a grid, I tend to think of it like this, like thinking like 3-dimensional grid around a planet, that grid might kind of warp inwards due to
Whoa.
gravity. It's like thinking about like a ball sitting on a trampoline, except
Interesting.
the trampoline is a 2-dimensional version, whereas the grid is more like 3D. But the empty space is not inherently warped.
Interesting.
So what that means is that the like curvature to empty space is flat. So the grid would just be standard cubes equal on all sides.
Wow.
But if we were to have positive curvature, we would see those cubes kind of warped so as to suggest that the universe is a sphere.
There's a shape. Right.
And if we were to see negative curvature, it would suggest, and this might be a little counterintuitive, but it would suggest it's kind of like Pringle shaped.
Okay.
Where it's, instead of curving around to a ball, it curves kind of like,
Okay.
yeah, like
Yeah.
a Pringle. But what we find in reality is that it's flat. All of the cubes are
Cool.
exactly as you would expect them to be. And the greatest point of evidence for this, on the last episode with Joe Rizzi, which you can tune into if you're interested in hearing this version of the explanation too. There's a thing called the cosmic microwave background radiation, just like, yeah, cool,
Okay.
a cool term.
Okay.
Yeah, astrophysicists like ate with that one.
No, they really did.
And that is the light from the exact moment that the universe became transparent, which means that at one point, really early into the universe's life, it was just like this hot, dense ball of like, I don't even want to say ball because that gives it that like curvature idea.
Right.
This like hot, dense collection of plasma. And light could not escape from it and move freely around in the way that light can now. It moves from stars to us, right?
Right.
And the exact moment that the universe cooled and expanded enough that light could pass through is captured in the cosmic microwave background radiation. It's the farthest back thing that we can see. So when we look back through space and we look back in time, we can see the exact moment that the universe became transparent, allowed us to see it.
That is so cool.
But because it's so far away,
Yeah.
and also because the universe has cooled so much since then,
Right.
the light itself has been shifted into microwave regions. So in the same way that you might have already heard of things being red or blue shifted,
Right.
just meaning that along the visible spectrum and the electromagnetic spectrum, they can move slightly one way or another way depending on a lot of different factors. And that's a long thing to try to explain. But it's shifted, meaning just that it's light, but it's light that's in a wavelength that we can't see.
Cool.
So it's microwave instead of
That's so cool.
typical visible light.
Wow. Cool.
Yeah.
I'm going to give that fact, it was very interesting, but I am going to give it a 7.
Okay.
Because I do feel like that's sort of how I've perceived the universe.
Yeah, I totally get that.
So, but that's very interesting to hear that that's actually sort of how it is. I mean, that's such an abstract thing to think about.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like that's the sort of thing where it's like makes my brain hurt a little bit trying to just imagine it. 'Cause
Yeah.
I've never seen the universe really.
Sure.
You
Not
know,
in that way, for
Not
sure.
in that way. I mean, I guess I literally am right now.
Yeah.
But, you know.
Everywhere, all around us.
Yeah, exactly. But that's really interesting. That's cool.
And the cosmic microwave background, because it's like, it was like this like weird grouping of stuff.
Yeah.
When it became transparent, it has like clumps almost of different temperature regions.
What?
And it's because we can tell the like separation between those clumps that we know that they must not have been curved due to anything. Just like, yeah, wild to think about. But I completely agree with you in that like it is the kind of thing that I guess I kind of just assumed about the universe.
Right.
I'm like, if I were to picture a grid in the universe, I would picture it changing near planets and not in empty space.
Yeah.
But I think it is interesting to note the idea that the universe isn't a sphere.
Right.
Because I think a lot of people think about like the Big Bang and therefore everything expanded outwards from one point, and you think about it in like terms of an explosion that you might see on Earth.
Right.
But really the Big Bang didn't explode out this like spherical universe.
Right.
The universe is flat in every way that we can measure it.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
That's
And the fact that we can do that because of like the first light that we can see, like I'm just like,
yeah, what?
Yeah.
Science is so cool. That's insane. Just the
Yeah.
fact that you found the microwaves
yeah.
in the universe. I can't believe we're here. Every time I hear something like that, I'm like, how did that even like? Oh my god! It blows my mind. It really does. That's really cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just make you happy to be here. Like, I'm glad that whatever had to work to make that happen
Right?
worked enough, and now I'm here.
And now I'm talking to Allyson Sheneman
Yeah.
on Curiosities of the Cosmos. That's really awesome.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And with that being said, we are due for our next break. So everybody stay tuned and we'll be right back. All right. Welcome back to WFNP 88.7 The Edge, Rosendale. This is continuing with Curiosities of the Cosmos. I'm your host, Allyson Sheneman, and I'm joined by Grace Sotillo, a junior and student of psychology and disaster studies at SUNY New Paltz. So for our last few minutes, and to end every episode, I ask the guests to bring in their favorite question that they've ever been asked. So Grace, what is your favorite question?
Well, difficult to answer. I hate being asked what my favorite things are because I'm an overthinker. However, I have come to a conclusion. Maybe it's not my favorite answer, but it's one of my favorite questions. Sorry.
Yeah.
Bringing in the Thanksgiving vibes of what are you grateful for?
Ooh.
And I really love that question because I think the gratitude and mindset is something that has really changed the way that I live my life. And it's something that I think evolutionarily, if we're talking evolution, we're very much hardwired as people to see what's wrong and what is a threat and what could possibly hurt us. And so we look to see the negative in every situation, which is a wonderful adaptive quality about us. And it's something that I'm grateful for in us, because if we didn't have that, we wouldn't know when things were dangerous and when to get away from situations. But also, sometimes we forget to see all that we have and all that's great in our lives. And I think especially when you're in a really like dark place, it's nice to be like, oh, but you know, at the end of the day, I have this really good sandwich that I took a bite out of today. And you know, maybe my day was really bad, but I had that really yummy sandwich, and that's something that I'm grateful for. And I think that's just such a beautiful mindset shift to have. And so I also love to ask it in people, to just see like, what are the things that you love about life? Like, what makes you happy to be alive? Because I think we all deserve to be happy to be alive, no matter what situation we're in. And it's nice to be able to highlight that, I think. So
That is such a beautiful sentiment. This idea that, like, no matter what your, like, individual days or weeks or months or years might look like, that there's always something that you can find to be happy about, be grateful for. I think it's a practice that you introduced once at one of the meals that we were having, where you were saying, like, I don't remember if it was at the beginning or at the end of the meal, to just, or somewhere in the middle maybe, to just have, like, taken a second and pull yourself out of whatever feelings you're having about your day at that moment.
Right.
And try to really, like, not force yourself, but to let it come to you that there were good things that happened too.
Yeah.
And to really try to, like, refocus on those. I think it's
Right.
such an empowering, like, practice to do.
Absolutely. I like that you said that it felt empowering for you. That makes me really happy. And I think ultimately that's the goal of these sorts of practices, is to bring the power and control back into yourself for your life. Because when things go wrong, you don't want them to. So it always feels like you're out of control. And that's a really terrible feeling to feel, when it's like, I can't control all these bad things happening in my life and I don't feel good. And I can't do anything about it. That's a terrible feeling to feel, and it's a very real one to feel.
Totally.
But to have, for even 5 minutes, a feeling of empowerment of who you are and of your life, and I really like this thing. Not only does it, bring awareness of something happy in your life, but it also gives awareness to yourself to know what you can do in your day-to-day to give that feeling to you. So if your answer really was, oh, I really liked that sandwich that I ate today, then when you're having a bad day, that sandwich that you made or that you bought brought you that level of happiness on another bad day. You know what? I'm having a bad day. I want to bring control back into my life, and I'm going to go have that sandwich for lunch because I want to be happy for even a second. And I think that's a really beautiful practice, for sure. And I love that you said it felt empowering, because that's exactly what it feels like for me in my life. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think what I love about what you just said is that it really does get to be that simple. And it's a hard practice to start doing.
Absolutely.
Because it's so not, like, just a part of your day already, for I think most people. But I think it's so empowering once you do start doing it, because that repetition makes it a habit.
Yeah.
And when it becomes a habit, it really can start to change the way that you perceive your day to day.
Absolutely.
And I think that it's something I certainly wish I did more. And every time that I do it, I realize, like, how good it feels to have done.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips in, like, from a psychology background, in how people can implement it into their day-to-day, how they can remember to do it day-to-day, and how that, like, habit might start to build? I know something that I try to be more intentional about, because you brought it to one of our meals, is when I sit down to eat, to remind myself of something that I'm grateful for. That's kind of like a little reminder for me. Do you have any other, like, tips or tricks for somebody who's trying to maybe start to implement that into their day-to-day?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes me so happy that you do that, firstly. But also, I think exactly that, putting it into your routine in some way is probably the best way to remember it in your day-to-day, especially just literally from that sensory input of, oh, I'm getting up in the morning and I'm gonna scroll on my phone, and you have that repetitive movement to then think, like, if you assign, like, when I scroll on my phone in the morning, I'm gonna think of or write down in my notes app what I'm grateful for in the morning. Just finding something that you do every day, like sitting down for a meal, and making that a checkpoint for when you're going to check in for what you're grateful for is a great way to do that. I remember this always stuck with me, but I was talking about this with someone in one of my classes, and it's something that they like to do when they watch the sunset, and they try to make they try to make a habit of watching the sunset every day, and thinking about what they're grateful for in their day. That's one way to do it. I think
beautiful.
That's a beautiful way to do it. So just finding any routine of yours and trying to put it in there, and also forgiveness for yourself if you don't do it. There's no person, like, saying it's life or death if you don't do this. it's okay. If you don't, you could just do it again tomorrow or whenever you remember next. And there's nothing wrong with forgetting. There's nothing wrong with having a bad day. That's okay. That's okay. It's just when you feel like you need that and you remember when you check in, then that's a beautiful thing. And any step you make is a wonderful step, even if it's not a step that you take every day. So,
It's beautiful.
yeah.
Yeah, I like the idea too. I can picture somebody like on their like typical commute home, like a long drive, and you're just kind of like alone with your thoughts, and you're watching the sunset to take that second. And I think it's such a beautiful thing to implement into as daily as of a practice as you need it. Right. And on the days that you don't need it, it's okay to forget.
Absolutely.
And it's okay to forget on the days that you do need it, as long as at some point you remember, and when you do your best to bring it back in. Right?
Absolutely. Even if you're just doing it, you know, for our U.S. listeners, at the Thanksgiving table, if that's the only time you do it, that's a wonderful thing.
Yeah.
You know?
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, with that being said, we are at our timestamp for the end of the episode.
What?
I know, it just flies by. So thank you guys for listening. That's unfortunately all the time we had for today. So thank you again, Grace, for coming on the show. And of course, thank you to all of our listeners. This has been your host, Allyson Sheneman, and my guest.
Thank you so much. I'm Grace Sotillo.
on Curiosities of the Cosmos.